Good afternoon, good morning to all of you attending the 2022 Global Roundtable of UNEP FI. Thank you very much for joining this arguably very important session on the challenge and topic of net zero emissions by 2050. My name is Remco Fischer. I'm the climate team lead at UNEP FI, and I'll be moderating this very distinguished panel today on really globally, how do we reach net zero, but also more specifically on how financial institutions working with their portfolio companies and working in the context that they operate in can be a driving force really for net zero. Not that financial institutions and their clients could deliver net zero alone by themselves. They're not almighty, but I think it's fair to say that there is no way to net zero without the finance sector, that they are almost a necessary, their involvement is a necessary condition for net zero, but it's perhaps not a sufficient condition. And we will be discussing some elements of that also during the panel. Where do we currently stand on net zero in the finance sector? There are now 7 finance industry alliances on net zero, where the full membership is committed to reaching portfolio net zero emissions by 2050. These 7 alliances are part of a network of such alliances called GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is chaired by UN Special Envoys Mark Carney, Michael Bloomberg, and also by Mary Shapiro. Now, of the 7 alliances, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, launched back in 2019, was the first such alliance on net zero, and provided the blueprint, it's fair to say, and a little bit, I would say, the inspiration also, to the rest of the alliances. As UNEP, we're facilitating 3 of them: the Asset Owners with 75 members, the Net Zero Banking Alliance with over 100 members now, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance with 25 members. And in these 3 alliances alone, there's 200 financial institutions roughly committed to net zero by 2050, but also to aligning with 1.5. And what's currently happening with these alliances is that they're in motion, I would say, in motion from commitments having been made towards now action. It's a motion from commitments to action. And there's one critical element in between those 2 things, in between the commitment and the action, that is particularly important, and that's the target settings, because the targets are the instruments, the operational short-term targets or shorter-term targets are the instruments through which commitments translate into something more tangible, something against which progress can be measured, and something on which strategies and measures and ultimately action really can happen. So that's why targets are really important. They're really important to the credibility of the alliances. They're really important features of how the alliances govern themselves. And today, what we want to do with this discussion is shed a little bit of light on how are the alliances getting on with such target setting? How are they getting on also beyond target setting already? What are the challenges that we see in target setting, in target reaching? Again, target setting important, obviously target reaching even more important. What are the challenges that we see there? And how might we, by working together, overcome those challenges in again, setting targets and reaching targets. We have a great panel, and I'm very grateful for the panelists for joining us on this occasion. I'll quickly introduce them just very, very briefly. We have on the panel Tracey McDermott, who is Head of Conduct, Financial Crime and Compliance at Standard Chartered, and also Chair of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. We have Guenther Thallinger, who's a member of the Allianz Group Board and Chair of the UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And we have Juvencio Maeztu, who is Deputy CEO and CFO of IKEA. So let me start with a first round of questions to our panelists. And let me start perhaps with Guenther yourself. You've been at this the longest, so I'll start with you. AUA has been around for 3 years, grown from 12 members to now 75 members very quickly. How do you see the progress of the alliance has made over the last 3 years on target setting, beyond target setting, and what do you think are the key challenges ahead? Over to you, Guenther, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to participate here in this panel. In terms of the longest, one should clearly say, I mean, UNEP FI is really there for quite some time. And in our case, also very important principles of responsible investments also really playing this game for a long time. And I would say clearly setting the stage for then something like a net zero asset owner alliance. And we are very grateful that we are convened then by UNEP FI and got this chance. Now, as you said already, we are more than 70 members. We have this target setting out there. This is very much as many corporates by now have it. And this is very good. It's a very good story. Many corporates have not only net zero commitments for 2050, they have clearly also set 2030 targets, some 2025. The Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance has 44 members with 2025 targets. This is overall, I would say, a positive development. But as you also alluded already, that's not it. The thing is, what targets are set? How robust are those? What dimensions in the targets are really covered? So are especially emissions, absolute emissions, or at least relative emissions targeted? And then the very important part of progress reporting comes in. And we at the Asset Owner Alliance have now our second progress report where we really tell how the various members are not only setting the targets, but how they are really implementing so that these targets are indeed realized. Now, it is the second progress report. We are not, of course, at our targets yet, but what we can show is that it is possible to move towards these targets. And in these times, in these discussions that we have, I believe such a message is very important because we go away from the usual or very often usual alarmist type of messaging to there is a way, we really show a way, and we even allow then people to start to gain trust in the target setting and in the making of progress. Certainly with the second progress report, there's not so much of a basis for trust, but it starts that we go in a certain direction, and we strongly believe this trust building will happen more and more. Let's say the more frequently and the more, let's say in a regular form, we report against these targets. Now, what I should mention, as you said already, there are many financial institutions doing this, and this is great because we have then a real movement, and that movement helps in the target setting implementation because we do need to really transform these portfolio companies, as we call it. So basically those companies, those partners where we provide financing, where we are shareholders, debt holders, and also providing other forms of loans. And with them, these discussions can actually happen in this context, and this gets more and more easy. The more financial institutions are out there, also a very good development. One final point on this target setting question, we are also aware that it is important to clearly communicate policy requests. Why is that? We cannot, as financial institutions, as investors, do it kind of alone, not even for our business scope. Even for our business scope, we must admit that certain policies must change. And we have strong policy requests. We know that some of them are very difficult in certain jurisdictions, but nevertheless, let me mention them. We clearly advocate for a price of carbon. We clearly advocate for stopping fossil subsidies. And we also go very much in the direction of there must be standardized reporting. And perhaps we can talk about, let's say, especially that topic, standardized reporting, later on. So that's a little bit, let's say, a tour de force, let's say, on target setting, especially from the AOA perspective.
Thank you very much, Guenther. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on. Not only is it important that targets are set, it's important that they're high quality targets. You know, that makes them credible, that they are based on quantitative metrics, that they relate to, you know, the best established science, the scenarios. So, and we've tried across the alliances to establish the same logics and to establish the same quality of standard for the targets. That we find also to be very important. Also, yes, I think we're going to touch during the discussion today. Obviously, if it's only 5 institutions setting targets, that doesn't change the system. If it's 5,000 institutions across the financial and the real economy setting targets, and they're all following the same vision and mission, so the same level of ambition, that starts moving the needle. And if that happens both on the financial side of things and also on the real side of things, and we'll speak on that shortly with Juvencio also in terms of how the real economy is moving on targets, then we start shifting systems. And if then policymakers come in and do help internalize the carbon externality and do all the rest of it, then of course we are onto something that might even deliver, this very difficult task of net zero by 2050. That's great. Thank you very much, Guenther. Let's move from, we'll stay within the financial economy, but moving from the investors to the banks. And Tracey here, NISPA has seen, of course, the Net Zero Banking Alliance explosive growth. It's been the fastest growing alliance, I think, of all, with going from 0 to 100 in not 18 seconds. That would be an engine or so, but in 18 months, 0 to 100 in 118 months. What's yours beyond membership growth? What's your sense of progress at the moment in the alliance, in the banking industry, including but not only on targets, of course? Over to you, Tracey. Thank you.
Thanks, Remco, and thanks for inviting me to join this panel. As you said, actually, there's been extraordinary growth in the Net Zero Banking Alliance since we started last April with, I think, 42 founder members, and now up to something like 115 plus from across the globe. And I think that growth in membership is a real recognition of the fact that if we are going to solve the challenges that climate change presents to all of us, it's got to be a system-wide change. And the banks are at the heart of enabling that transition in the real economy, because one of the big challenges that we know we've got is that actually funding the transition is going to be a key enabler to actually being able to deliver. It's not just about decarbonising our own portfolios, it's actually about how do we support the real economy to make that transition in a way which is fair. So by signing up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, our members have made ambitious commitments at the most senior level. So obviously net zero by 2050, but also interim targets by 2030, and with a requirement to have set those targets for the most impactful sectors within 18 months of joining, and then for all 9 high emitting sectors within 36 months. So we're actually just about to do our first progress report, Guenther talked about his second, which will talk about where we are. We can see that of those members who are due to have set targets, we have seen the significant majority setting targets and starting off in the really difficult areas. So oil and gas, coal, the really high emission, hard to abate sectors. So I'm really pleased that we are making real progress. Similarly to the Asset Owners Alliance, there is a commitment to ongoing transparency and reporting. So we will be able to see over time how are those targets changing and how are people delivering against them. And you mentioned that, Remco, as a sort of tool to help measure progress. From an internal perspective, speaking from the perspective of a bank that's a member and has targets, having those targets is critical to enabling you to say, okay, what is our strategy? What impact does that have on our business? What kind of, we say to our colleagues and our clients, it is that we need them to do. And so those targets are not just numbers on a page, they're actually what's driving the strategy in key areas of the economy for our banking members. So I think that is a really, really significant step. You mentioned challenges, so many of those, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of those. But I think as we've been through this journey, data is an issue. Guenther talked about reporting, but actually the availability, the quality, the consistency of data is a challenge. We're using scenarios, we're using respected scenarios, but actually those scenarios are not granular. They don't distinguish at a geographic level. So we've had to all work out how we can make assumptions in relation to that. Clearly, the policy frameworks are evolving, and indeed our scientific knowledge is constantly evolving. As Guenther also mentioned, different governments are in different places in terms of their own net zero commitments, whether they have them at all or what timelines they're on, and also the sorts of policies they have in relation to supporting themselves through the transition. So there are a massive amount of challenges, but what I think is a real positive of the Alliance is that it has really shown that commitment for us to take that bold leap, to make the first steps, to set those targets and to collaborate together across the industry and with our clients in terms of how we will turn those into reality.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Tracey. And just, emphasizing some of the points again that you've made and putting those alongside Guenther, because we're painting a very complete picture of the importance of targets, but also, the features that targets have to effect the change that they're intended to change. So I think you mentioned, seniority. Yeah, they need to come from the heart of the organization, and that's what's happening in the Alliance. It's not only about technically the targets, the metrics being appropriate and being the right metrics, but obviously it's the extent, the gravitas with which they come and the importance that they play, within the institutions internally. Guenther spoke a little bit about the external signaling effect from target setting between the providers of capital, the recipients of capital, but of course it plays an important role internally within the organizations, implementing them. And then also you highlighted, which has been very much the approach, the importance of sector specificity, because ultimately we all know the economy decarbonizes when the sectors of the economy decarbonize. And I think it's the financial institutions can, within those sectors, catalyze those decarbonization efforts. And that sectoral dimension is very strong in NZBA, and it's also becoming very stronger over time in the AOA and in some of the other alliances. Thank you very much, Tracey, for that. Let's move on to Juvencio. Now that we've heard from colleagues on the finance sector side of the equation, targets. How is this panning out for a company like IKEA, Juvencio, in the real economy? What do your targets look like? What do the targets of your peers in your sector and other sectors look like? And is what you're seeing from the financial economy, is that encouraging enough to you, or would you like to see even more?
Yeah, thank you, Remco. Hello, everybody. You talked, Remco, in your introduction about commitments, targets, and then actions. And I want to share with you how we are acting in these three actually at the same time. On one side, we have committed to Paris Agreement and to stay with the 1.5 degrees. And we have committed to reduce by more than 50% in absolute terms the greenhouse emissions before 2030. And then from there, net zero before 2050. So we have committed in absolute terms. So it's possible to decouple growth from actual reduction. And we follow science-based targets, which is extremely important to have a high level of methodology who can provide the reliable data. But it's not only in scope 1 and 2, the more direct emission, it's also scope 3, which is normally the most difficult one and where the biggest emission happens. So we have committed to reduce the greenhouse emission in scope 1, 2, and 3. And not only in the decarbonization of the supply chain, of the IKEA supply chain, but also we have committed to create a positive impact in the Go Beyond, which is about our investment we do in renewable, or the way we can support customers with home solar, or the carbon storage and carbon removal. So at the end of the day, it's not about neutralizing your supply chain, is also about creating a positive impact. So these are commitments. Then, of course, then the next step is how do you make it happen? These targets. For us, we have integrated performance in a holistic way. And we have clarified internally what good performance is about. Because I don't know anyone who wants to destroy the planet, but I know many leaders who are a bit lost in the how. And then it is good for the planet or it is good for the wallet. So to avoid this type of dilemmas that people face, we have clarified internally what good performance is about, and it's about our value creation goals. And we have decided that we are going to create value for customers, so better homes for customers, then better life for people. It's a social dimension of sustainability, which is as important as the climate. Then it's better planet for all, and then it's better company for the long term that can keep creating value. So we have clarified internally that a good performance is about delivering value to the customer, to the people and society, to the planet, and to the company. And in order to mitigate or to avoid dilemmas, we have integrated these 4 dimensions in the decision making. Every day, people are taking decisions, and we cannot put the people in dilemmas. That's why we approve financial investments. That comes with the requirement in the 4 dimensions. So at the end of the day, this is kind of an internal due diligence that allow the final financial investment to be approved or not. And then you talk about actions. And then for me, actions speak louder than words. So you have to prove, you have to walk the talk. You have to prove with action your commitment. And I can share you some of them. For example, today, IKEA material are 70% of them are either recycled or renewable. And then we are in the journey to become 100%. Then the range we said, we are famous, for example, by the traditional meatballs. Now we launched recently the plant-based ball. More than 1/3 of the sales come already from there. And it's 96% less CO2 and fantastic taste. Or for example, LED that we are selling at €1, because it's only when sustainability is affordable that can be really create a big impact. Or the home solar that we have started to sell in many countries, but also in the operation with the renewable heating and cooling or retrofitting, but also with our financial investment, because we have Inca investment with more than 20 billion euros fund to invest in climate positive activities in Inca. And then we have already committed 6.5 billion in renewable and produce more renewable energy than the energy we consume. So these are examples of action. So it is about commitment, it's about targets, it's about integrating to the decision making to avoid dilemmas, and finally, it's actions.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you so much, Juvencio. I think, when you were talking about, these dilemmas that, exist, or perhaps they're only perceived at times. I think that was also the point, that we perceive there's a trade-off to be made, and at the end of the day, there may be no trade-off, or even more, you can achieve, various goals at the same time in a way that they support each other, such as better houses, combined with better plan, better, people, and how that leads to a more, motivated workforce, and happier investors, hopefully, and happier lender. That's one question, perhaps. Are you seeing that the commitment and the actions coming from your shareholders, your bondholders, your lenders, is that yet on the radar? Is that already kind of a driver for you at IKEA to be going in this direction, or has it not become noticeable yet?
Yeah, it is actually. And the starting point is IKEA vision, which is create a better everyday life for the many people, which is even more relevant. So this is a starting point for everything we do. Then we are recruited in the company by values. And then on top of that, the shareholder of Inca Group is the Inca Foundation. So you could say that at the end of the day, almost everything goes back to society, because almost 29% right. goes to tax, and then it remains, and then dividends go to the foundation, not to the private pocket, that goes back to society. So we are built to last, and is connecting both action, but also with the IKEA vision.
Okay. Thank you very much, Juvencio, again. I think we can move on. I think we don't have too much time. We could go on, obviously, for hours on these topics. It's such an interesting conversation. Also, if you have questions to each other, I'm obviously meant to be asking the questions, but if you have questions to each other, just raise your hand, and you can be my co-moderator for a little bit of the discussion, because I think we will make it perhaps a little, even more interactive and insightful like that. But I would say that, you know, I think all of this is impressive. You know, if you put it all together, the targets that are being set by various parts of the economy, different sectors, you know, coming from really the mainstream of the economy, but then also coming from the financial sector, you would almost think box ticked. You know, we've solved climate change, and of course, nothing is further from the truth. And so I think still at this point, all of this discussion is happening. I don't want to say a bubble because it's bigger than a bubble, but it's still only a subset of economic and financial actors that are going in that direction. And so I think for the next bit of the conversation, we want to focus on how do we grow this? How do we make this the new normal? About how do we stop this being leadership and it becoming the new normal on both sides, the real and the financial economy? So let me just also ask the three of you, perhaps you, Tracey, first, just to change the order a little bit. What does the banking sector as a sector overall need from its stakeholders to achieve these targets that we've been discussing? And what is needed to really take this to, again, you know, move from the 100 members of NISPA to perhaps, you know, the thousands or so? What do we need for that, for the new normal? Over to you, Tracey. Thank you.
So the first thing I would say is actually to go back to a point I made earlier, which is that, you know, banks can play a really significant part in supporting clients to transition, but banks cannot transition the economy on their own. And, you know, in many ways, the easiest way to decarbonize a portfolio is just to exit clients that are high emitting. That may not be good for the other side of the wallet equation, but also it actually doesn't serve to actually support decarbonization of the real economy. So I think when we look at this, we've got to make sure that we are recognizing that there is a part for all of us to play. So whether it's real economy actors, whether it's asset owners, whether it's, you know, capital providers in the form of banks, we have a role to play. But there is also an enormous role to play for the public sector in its various forms. Part of that is actually around how do we unlock the amount of money that is needed to actually enable transition to be financed, adaptation to be financed. And, you know, depending on which report you read, the number of trillions varies a little bit, but everybody, I think, would agree that it is a vast sum of money, which is not going to be financed by the public alone, by the public purse alone, but it also needs some public creativity and thinking about things like blended finance guarantees, etc. How do you make projects investable? You also need, from a public sector, really targeted thinking about public funding. So how do they use their funding to enable some of these nascent technologies to become viable commercial investable vehicles? So we need that. We also need a joined up approach from governments within countries and ideally across countries to how they think about net zero transition. So if you're going to say you want a net zero commitment, you need to look at, well, what does that mean for your energy policy? What does that mean for your industrial policy? What does that mean for carbon pricing? What does that mean for taxes and so on? And I think it's really important to have that joined up approach. At a more micro level, supervisors, regulators, people who in the financial sector are kind of overseeing us, very interested in this area, and I think have been actually very influential in starting to get the financial sector to focus on this, probably more through a risk lens than through an opportunity lens, but actually coordination between those groups to try and say these are the sort of guidelines and this is how they can operate together, I think is really important, because otherwise you end up creating a bit of a mishmash of different sort of stress tests. Business and client engagement I've already touched on, and actually Juvencio's examples are fantastic. You know, we need to work with clients, we need to support them on the journey, but they also need to support us. And then I would also say that civil society, NGOs and other groups are a really, really important part of this ecosystem. And obviously part of their job is to hold all of our feet to the fire and to make sure that we are pushing ourselves constantly to go as far as possible. But I think we also need to recognize that in this space, there's actually a lot more that unites us than divides us. And I think really bringing together the power of having the financial sector, the real economy sector, and civil society working together to try and come up with solutions rather than just identify issues is also a really important part of it. So I'll pause there so people get a chance to speak, but probably a reasonable starting shopping list.
So yeah, thanks, Tracey. I mean, one thing that crossed my mind as you were speaking was, you know, at the beginning of the session today, we talked a little bit about the sequencing of commitment, target, action, and then obviously over time there needs to be progress reporting and adjustments to where progress is not being made. And actually how the private sector, perhaps because it is the private sector, is doing that very methodically and, you know, very thought through. And it just, and I started thinking, are we seeing that from governments? You know, we always hear, you know, how many governments around the world have committed to net zero. Fine, they've done the commitment bit, but you know, when you look at, then you look at their climate plans, you know, what, you know, they're called these NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. There's a mismatch between the actual plan and the target and the commitment. And that's why kind of, you know, actions very often, you know, are too slow or not enough. And so I wonder whether, you know, on this point, the private sector, you know, in its various manifestations of alliances could try to get governments to apply, you know, the same rigor, you know, between, yes, making the net zero commitment and then moving on to implementation and to target setting, you know, as quickly as possible, which I don't see, as you know, there's obviously some countries that do that, but in the vast majority of things, you know, I think we are failing to see that just now. And then there's the one government approach to things, that you see pockets of, you know, certain parts of government, yes, being ahead, but, you know, other parts of government actually going in a different direction potentially and creating confusion.
So I'll quickly respond to that, but I think, I mean, it's really hard to do this within a company. It must be infinitely harder to do this within a country, and then exponentially again to do it globally. But I think, and I think the heart of this, the core of this, is that government need to work with the private sector and with civil society to say, how do we make joint progress? Because actually, yes, I completely agree, there needs to be transparency, there needs to be reporting, there needs to be target, but actually underneath all of that, there needs to be that action as to how are we going to deliver this? Because, you know, unless every part of the ecosystem plays its part, we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve. That's right.
That's right. I think that's one of the things with net zero. It's either the whole system goes net zero, everyone wins, it's a big success. But if the whole system doesn't go to net zero, everyone loses, even if certain parts kind of, you know, we're on track. And then it's a big failure and a very consequential failure, it's fair to say, for everyone. Over to you, Guenther, again, just, you know, you started talking about, you know, the work that AUA has done on the systemic level of this, in terms of, you know, for instance, some of the policy positions that we've put out and the importance of carbon price, internalizing the externality, as the economists would put it. You know, obviously, you know, stop adding oil to the fire, stop fossil fuel subsidies, you know, and other such calls, things that the AUA has called for. Within policy or beyond policy, where else do you see the biggest challenges that, you know, together we could tackle?
Yeah, thank you. And if I may link this to what Juvencio explained on the company example, and then also what Tracey really mentioned, this part of the we. Let me start there. The so important thing is that we need to acknowledge the whole tackling climate change is a we story. It is where we all need to come together and work on it. And this is actually very, very positive. It's really very positive. In times where we have very, very often these individualistic views, this very, very, let's say, interesting positioning of certain forms of separate groups, a we story is actually quite motivating. And this is what we really need to somehow facilitate. Now, this V story needs certain forms of, let me say, target pictures that may also address this point. How can countries work on their NDCs? What I mean with target pictures is, it would be great if countries start to take their NDCs and then really come with, what is our energy market going to look like in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? Why is that important? Because countries can then start to do backwards planning and indicate what forms of infrastructure change do we actually need to see, facilitate, foster in our country. This is great. Why? Because then all of a sudden the private sector can come in on a competitive basis. I'm not dreaming up that we get all of a sudden a non-competitive market. No, on a competitive basis. But we can actually, let's say, as competitors, try to address what governments would line out in terms of their target pictures and their planning in a little bit more of a longer term. By the way, this is also what would help the whole transition finance of developing economies. Because if they would have the target pictures and then come up with, for instance, infrastructure pipelines, blended finance vehicles could come in like pieces of an overall puzzle game. And that's what we really are looking forward. And there is perhaps an overall target picture that, in the sense of a V story, we should start to somehow consider, which is, we are all trying to get towards a sustainable economy, or much more important, we are trying to get towards an economy that actually gets us into a sustainable society. And Juvencio's examples were so clear exactly in that direction. Now, unfortunately, not every company is IKEA. It would be great, to be honest, for us investors, at least, very nice. But as Juvencio said, not so much of a chance to get in if you would like, because there's a foundation owning it, happy foundation. So it is good to have these examples, how sustainable economy can look like, how a company playing the part in the economy works towards this, let's say, sustainability. And in that, then there are many of certainly complex topics. We mentioned them already. How do we actually get to our information delivery? So the standardized reporting and all the like. But I'm not going to go now to these technical details, because we somehow mentioned it. But they would link up to this target picture. If I may finish, one thing that is really important, this V story needs to also acknowledge that not everybody can launch, found a new initiative. We need to get to an end of the let's put things on top of other things in terms of initiatives. We need to get to an end there. Why is that? Because at the moment, many people feel inclined, oh yeah, it's really important to go towards net zero. Let's think about an initiative. No. Let's rather think, what initiatives are out there? How can they be supported? And how can we make sure that what those initiatives, alliances, groups, movements have communicated as targets, how that can be used to drive the true change? Because we need to make sure that capacity, expertise that is available today is not working on concept papers, but rather uses the concept papers and says, okay, impact in terms of the change in our decision-making, exactly as Juvencio said, integrating climate change in the decision-making. This now needs to happen. The time has come where we need to more and more, all of us, work on the true change using the concepts already developed.
That was great, Guenther. Yes, those are really great points. I think number one, for business, but also for government, financial, climate change needs to be everywhere, right? Every decision needs to be seen among many lenses, obviously, conventional financial lenses, but also how is this decision, how is this product, how is this client, how is this investee company going to help me as a company deliver on my target and become climate smart and climate compatible. I also really like this. I think, what's the role of competition? Where's competition good and where's collaboration good, right? And there, there's the we story. At that point, we need to collaborate, but that's more defining where do we want to go as a society? Where do we want to go as a finance sector? Where do we want to go as an oil and gas industry? That's the we moment. And then, of course, I think, getting there, this is where the market probably can be the very efficient and the best delivery mechanism of getting us there. And actually, I always say getting the market-based approach to economy to do its magic also on the environment, also on the planet, as it's done in other parts of for other objectives such as poverty eradication and development more broadly, etc. I feel a little bit guilty as the UN because we're very good at creating initiatives. We're not so good at then letting them go. So mushrooming initiatives is a problem. So Guenther, if at any point we need to have a conversation, I'm all ears as to how we can consolidate and simplify and streamline things. Anyway, over to you, Juvencio. You heard it. It would be good if all the companies were like IKEA. That would make the job of the investors easier. How what are the pathways to making that happen from your perspective? How can you get all of your peers to follow that leadership that you've established?
Very good. I would say, like number 3, I would summarize in 3 things. The first one is based exactly what Guenther said. How can we integrate much more? And then in the way we do investments, we normally try to maximize the financial side, the returns of the investment. But I think more and more we have to optimize the financial side and the planet side. And it's not maximization of one, it's optimization of both. And why do I say this? Because if you don't do this, at the end of the day, it's going to cost even more for the shareholder. If I take an example, we started to invest big amount of money in renewable energy some years ago. Today, somehow we are macro hedging ourselves. So that's why it is lower cost, because we have invested in the past. So I truly believe that sustainability has to be the new low-cost economy. And by optimizing, not maximizing the financial side with the sustainability side, we can create an impact in the planet, but also reduce the cost in the future. So it's a long-term value. I think we have to really influence more for common standards. Common standards in the disclosure and reporting on sustainability-related information, because this is the basis for a well-functioning global financial system. There are efforts happening today by the International Sustainability Standard Board or the SEC or the European Commission. That's good, but we have to integrate much more and to have one common standard. Like we have with accounting GAAP principle, we need to have the same language across sustainability disclosure. We need to do more, which is not enough today. And finally, we have to collaborate. Nobody can do everything, but everybody must do something. And we must collaborate to help each other. We're collaborating with WEF Climate Allianz, with the women business or with the B team, but we have to collaborate much more to advocate for all these changes in society.
Thank you very much. That was pure wisdom there, not to maximize one thing. I think that's probably a little bit the historical error that has been made in many companies around the world in the market-based capitalistic system, to maximize always shareholder value in the conventional sense, or maximize the financial metrics and just focus myopically on that, whereas it's about optimizing various returns, optimizing the financial returns, the social returns, environmental returns, the loyalty returns, the talent retention returns. It's a much more holistic approach. That is I think pure wisdom there. Thank you very much, Juvencio. And yes, we need to wrap up. We don't have time, but I just want to thank wholeheartedly the 3 of you for being leaders in your industries, and I mean it when I say it, in terms of not only speaking about these topics on panels and in sessions, but actually doing the hard work internally of mainstreaming this into business strategy, into business outlook. So thank you for that. sincerely, but also thank you, of course, for joining us for today's discussion at UNEP FI's Global Roundtable. And let's try to work more together. That will be my final word. You know, you mentioned we've got the net zero alliances in finance. You know, we've got the platforms in the real economy that you mentioned that you're a part of with your peers at the same level of ambition. How can we bring all of that together for the collaborative part of what Guenther was talking about? And then, of course, you know, you can all compete again, but there needs to be a balance between collaboration and competition. Thank you very much again, and over to the overall Global Roundtable chair now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.